Today, we're going to be talking about color grading inside of Adobe Premiere Pro, so let's jump in and get started. Starting off with our workspace. You're going to want to be in the color workspace, and to do so, go to the upper right-hand corner, select the workspace icon, and select color. What this is going to do is it's going to put Lumetri scopes on the left-hand side of your image, put Lumetri color on the right-hand side, and then your footage right in front of you, dead center. If you don't have scopes on the left, just choose Window and go down to Lumetri Scopes. And I like to use the Waveform RGB scope. If you don't have the Waveform RGB scope, click this little wrench icon, select Waveform RGB. And if your waveform is set to something like Luma, just go to Waveform Type and make sure you are on RGB. Now let's go to the Adobe Lumetri color panel, and I will quickly walk you through what all these settings are because they can be a little confusing. Starting with your input LUT. This is very important if you do edit with log profiles, and I'm going to hit on this a little more if you shoot in sRGB or Rec 709. You don't really need to worry about the input LUT. Below that we have color. So this is where you can adjust the white balance, temperature, tint, saturation. And then we have exposure below that, where you can adjust exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, white point, black point. Next is the creative panel. If you are using creative LUTs, this is where you're going to use those because it gives you an intensity slider. If you would use a creative LUT as an input LUT, and Adobe does allow you to do so, you can't adjust the intensity. So if you do put on a creative LUT and it's a little too intense, you can dial it down, or if it's not intense enough, you can dial it up. And that is where the creative panel really shines. You can also add some faded film effect, sharpen, adjust the vibrance, saturation, and tint. If you want to add a tint to the shadow or a tint to the highlight, you can do so here. And then next down we have curves, and this is where a lot of the heavy lifting is done in color grading. So we're going to spend a lot of time in the curves. Let's start off with the master curve. So the way this works is you have your shadows down here on the left, and you have your highlights in the upper right here, and then your midtones sit right around here. You also have the primaries, so you have R, G, and B here. If you want to adjust the red, green, or blue values independently, you can do so here. Double-clicking will reset it. Down from that, we have the hue versus sat curve. So what this allows you to do is adjust the saturation of a specific hue. So let's say I just want to boost the saturation of this orange back here. I can just select the warmer tones and pump the saturation of that, and it doesn't affect the blue because it is over here and not affected. You also have a eyedropper if you want to eyedrop a specific color and adjust that. Next up we have hue versus hue, and what hue versus hues allows you to do is select certain colors and then adjust the hue of just that color. So let's say I wanted to adjust the hue of the blue. I can basically select the blue color, and this allows me to change just the blue color without affecting any other color in the image. A super helpful tool. Both of these, the hue versus sat, hue versus hue, I use quite a lot. Next up we have hue versus luma, and what this allows you to do is just change how bright or dark a specific hue is. And so if there's something in the image that you wanted to darken, like if I wanted to darken just my shirt, I can select my shirt here and just bring down just the hue of that shirt. And so this again is a very powerful tool. I don't use it as much, but it is super helpful to have. Next up we have luma versus sat. And the best way to look at this graph is on the left is your shadows, on the right is your highlights, and this is the saturation of each of those. So if you want to adjust the saturation of just the shadows in your image, you can do so here. Or if you want to desaturate your shadows, you can do so. If you want to saturate your highlights or desaturate your highlights, you can do so here. I don't use this curve as much, but again, super helpful when you need it. And lastly, we have the most confusing curve of them all, sat versus sat, saturation over saturation. And I will do my best to kind of explain what this is. On the left here, we have the most desaturated parts of the image. On the right here, we have the most saturated parts of the image. So what you can do with this curve is, if you have some parts of your image that are super saturated and you have some parts that are desaturated, if you just adjust the saturation, it is going to lift the saturation of the whole image, whereas here it gives you the ability to just saturate the areas of the image that are desaturated without affecting the saturation of the oversaturated areas. And so if you do a bit of an S curve here, this gives you the option to kind of level out the overall saturation of an image without having to shift up or down the entire saturation curve. It's a very confusing curve. I don't use it a ton, but again, it's super helpful to have. And when you learn how all of these work, it just really helps you be a much better colorist. Next up, we have a three-way color corrector here. And so this allows you to tint and adjust just the shadows, the midtones, and the highlights. And so if I wanted to add some blue to the shadows and some warmth to the highlights, I can do so here. I can also adjust the intensity, so how bright or dark just the midtones are, shadows, and highlights are. Super helpful. I'm not a huge three-way color corrector guy, but again, you're not going to use all of these tools at the exact same time, but knowing how they work can be super helpful. Next here we have HSL secondary, and this is probably my most used part of Lumetri color. This allows you to select specific hues and saturations and luminances and affect just those values very, very specifically. And so just to show you real quick, if I would want to select just my shirt here, I can color pick just my shirt, go here and see, let's adjust, we're gonna wanna adjust our luminance here. And so H stands for hue. And so by opening this up or clamping it down, you're selecting the hues below it. And the second one here, S, is saturation. So if I want just the desaturated parts of the image, or I just want to select the saturated parts of the image, this is how you would do so. And right now we're just trying to select my shirt, so we want to avoid selecting my face. And then L is luminance. So if you want to select the dark parts or the light parts, a very confusing tool at first, but the more you use it, the easier it gets, and it's just basically second nature at this time. I always add a touch of denoise and blur that just softens the edges. And then once I have this selected, I am free to pretty much adjust the color however I want. And so I can go in here, adjust temperature, tint, contrast, sharpness, saturation of just that very, very specific hue, saturation, and luminance value. Super powerful tool, and I will show you when we get to editing how I use that. And lastly is vignette. Pretty simple tool here. You can either add a dark vignette or you can add a white vignette. You would add a white vignette if you're using a lens that naturally vignetted a little bit, so you can add a little bit of white to counteract what that lens is doing. But again, I'm not really a big vignette guy, but it's here if you want to use it. So that is the Lumetri color panel. So let's get into some raw clips and we can start editing here. starting with the input value. I mentioned earlier how I would hit on the input value or the input LUT. So let's do that with a color chart. So I know a lot of people, if they shoot in log, they grade the log by adding an S-curve, adjusting the contrast, the saturation. And for me personally, I think that's the wrong way to do it. And I will show you exactly why with this color chart. So this color chart is shot in Canon log 3. And so if I add in the Cinegamut Canon log 3 to BT709 LUT, you can see right now we have pretty much the perfect white point, the perfect black point, and all the saturation and color values are already set. And that is without touching anything. So that is just putting the input LUT on. You can see how much it changes the image. And we can do the same thing over here by going to curves, adjusting the curve, putting a nice little S-curve in here. We're going to adjust the white point to get that up here, adjust the black point, and we're going to add in some saturation. And so again, we've gotten rid of the log look, but if you look at the colors between these two are drastically different, especially if you look at the primaries. So you have your red, your green, and your blue. This is the image that all we did was adjust the saturation and put in a bit of an S-curve, this is how a lot of people teach how to edit log footage. And this is by using an input LUT. And so the input LUTs are provided from camera manufacturers, whether you shoot Canon, Sony, Panasonic, Blackmagic. Every camera manufacturer offers input LUTs or transform LUTs, as they're often called, sometimes called technical LUTs as well. And the main purpose of a technical LUT is to tell those values exactly what they should be from a log profile to a BT709 profile. And so if you look here, your reds, your greens, your blues are exactly where they need to be. And if we look here, the reds, the greens, the blues are off, wildly off actually. And you could go through and adjust them independently, but that is a lot of time and a lot of effort. So please, if you take anything out of this, if you shoot with a log profile, use an input LUT. It's going to save you a ton of work when it comes to the grading process. And then I also grade in a bit of a layer-based method. And so I use a ton of adjustment layers. The first one is typically my base grade. So on the clip itself, I'll add an input LUT. On the second layer up will be my base grade. And then from here, I'll do any kind of creative looks. So if I want to tweak the colors or do anything over top of that base grade, I do that here. And then typically on top of that is any windows or HSL secondaries or any minor tweaks that I want to make on top of the base and the creative grade. So let's start with the base. We're going to throw in a bit of a curve. Not too aggressive here, and I like to bring the black point up just a hair. As you can see, I'm pretty blown out here, but I'm not too worried about that at this point. And we're gonna bring the shadows up, maybe add a touch of saturation. All right, for this first, I want to call it a node because it's kind of how you would edit in DaVinci Resolve. But so in the second layer, this is more creative edits. And so in this edit, I am going to focus mainly on myself. And as bad as that sounds, what we're going to do is add in a bit of a window. And so I just want to affect myself. I don't want to really affect the rest of the image. We're going to add a pretty aggressive feather to this. And so what this is just masking the actual color effect, and we're gonna bring the shadows way down and go to HSL secondary, and we're gonna start making sure that I am selected. And right off the bat, that's a pretty decent selection. And we're gonna add a little bit of temperature, a little bit of saturation, a little bit of contrast. And I think I might actually add a touch of magenta too. I feel like I'm a little green there. Maybe a little more warmth. And so now you're seeing the difference between this and that, and I'm only affecting myself in this part. And then the next adjustment layer here, I'm going to focus mainly up back here. This is a little too yellow for my liking. So what we're gonna do is grab our selection tool. We're gonna select just this back wall here. So we don't want to select too much of myself. Add a bit of a blur. And we're gonna push this. We're gonna put a healthy amount of magenta in to kind of make it a little more pink. And so we go from kind of a mustard to more of a burnt. Maybe went a little too hard there. And we're gonna add a little bit of blue in as well. So we're kind of going from mustard to burnt orange. Very subtle. A lot of my changes tend to be very subtle. And the last one is going to be a flip of myself. So we're going to select what would be myself. Let's select. Cool. And what we're going to do is this icon here will invert that mask. And so you can see how that is inverted now. Let's make sure we don't have any of my skin tones selected. And what we're going to do is add a tinge of blue and some contrast. And so if we look at the before and after, it's just adding a little bit of a blue hue into the background. And then when we look at the before and after, this is before and that is after. And that is how I edit pretty much all of these shots that you're looking at right now. It is edited exactly this way. Next up is a shot from down in Florida. This was shot with a C70. We're gonna do the same thing. We're gonna bring in just my army of adjustment layers. Starting off, we're gonna wanna bring in, so this is straight log. I remember shooting BT709 Canon Log 3, and so we're going to use the Canon adjustment LUT. Again, it is free. It's from Canon. You can find it on their website. If you shoot Sony or Panasonic, it is on their website as well. So definitely get transform LUTs if you're going to shoot log. And then the second one is our base. So what we're going to do is I want more of a moody look here, so I'm going to kind of go a little heavy on the curve and lift that ever so slightly. I want to bring the highlights down, boost the shadows just a bit. Maybe went a little too heavy on the curve. We'll bring the mid-tones up. And then next what we're going to do is I kind of want to boost the greens, so add some saturation to the greens. And then I'm actually going to take the green hue and I'm going to drop the luminance. So I want to kind of make the grass a little darker. And that looks pretty good to me. On the second adjustment layer, I think what we're going to do is affect the sky. And we're going to do that by taking our Lumetri color. We're going to just select the sky, very rough here. It helps if I actually hit the point. All right. And we're gonna go back to, I'm not lying when I say HSL secondary is my most used thing. And we're going to make sure that we have all the sky selected here. So we're just gonna widen this out to make sure that there's nothing really being missed there. I don't mind selecting the trees because what we can do is just go to the luminance and make sure we're not selecting any super dark luminance values. That bit of a blur, bit of a denoise, and then what we're going to do is throw some blue into the sky there and probably bring down the midtones just a hair. Maybe add a bit of contrast as well. So that is our before and after for the sky, maybe a little more blue in the sky. So this is before and after in the sky. Very subtle, but I think it makes a big difference. And then lastly, what we're gonna do is, again, you guessed it, HSL secondary. We're going to just select these benches here. So we want to not select the sky, make sure to select just the highlighted parts of the benches. And we're going to add a little bit of warmth. So you can see that on the benches here and in the sand. Just a tad of warmth. And I think overall, I still want to maybe bring the shadows down a hair. And we might bring the highlights. Pretty happy with the highlights there. And so let's look at the before and after. So here we go. Let's turn off the input LUT. And that is the before. And that is the after. I hope you guys learned something from this video. I know I've received a few comments of people asking for me to break down my color grading workflow, and this is exactly how I color grade each and every one of my videos. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in another one.